Okay. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon and good evening. Today, our webinar from ISACA Baghdad chapter is presented by Zerofox. Other people platform defeating online fraud outside your virtual jurisdiction. Well, I would like to thank Dr. Sam Small and Farouk for this initiative and for offering us this new informations. And as we say always, that ISACA Baghdad chapter is trying to raise the information security awareness in Iran. Thank you so much, Zerofox. Thank you, Farouk from Cybercode, and thank you for Amanda, of course. And I will give the mic now to Dr. Sam to start the webinar. Thank you so much. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Thanks for having us. Like Ali said, good afternoon and good evening. I'm Sam Small. I'm the Chief Security Officer here at Zerofox, and I'm very excited. This is my first time in the Gulf region virtually. I haven't been there physically yet. I hope to sometime in the near future when it's safe for all of us to travel again, etc. So I hope everyone is safe and doing well. And again, thank you for sharing your time with us. What we're going to do today is we're going to cover kind of two topics that I've put together, but they all revolve around what we call digital risk. And digital risk in particular is the expertise of Zerofox. So we help our customers identify digital risk when it takes place, categorize it automatically, and then help our customers mitigate and remediate those risks. So this is not a commercial for Zerofox. I'm not going to talk a lot about the product, but what I am going to do is share with you some information so that you can better understand this area of concern and risk, and so that you can reflect upon how you currently handle these issues in your organization, or to help you maybe understand how you want to put that capability on your roadmap and perhaps mature your organization in the future. I just want to point out briefly, my email address is here at the bottom of this first slide. It's my first initial and my last name, small@zerofox.com. Feel free to reach out to me if you have questions or would like to follow up. This information will also be available at the end of the webinar. If you have any questions at any time during the presentation, please submit your question through the GoToWebinar control panel. I'll try to take a peek during the webinar at different times to see if there are any questions about material that we're currently covering, but otherwise I will try to get to questions at the end of the session. And if you submit a question and I don't answer it live during the webinar, I promise you I will follow up by email. So with that, I'd like us to get started. What we're going to do first is talk about a taxonomy of digital threats. Why do we want to do this? Well, this allows us to categorize and classify the various types of risks and threats that we see in the digital landscape, and there are many, and it's important to be able to categorize them and differentiate between them because they present different types of risks and different levels of severity, and they also require different approaches, not only to identifying them proactively, but to also performing mitigation or remediation to either have content removed or to update your own security policies, practices, and systems to deal with those issues and threats. So that's why we've created this taxonomy. And what you'll see here in the presentation is there's 4 primary categories of digital threats. So we're going to cover their impacts briefly across the organization. We're going to talk about briefly techniques to detect and remediate against those types of threats, and I'll also give some examples. And then we'll move on to talking about once you find these types of threats, some of the common issues you might run into in terms of mitigating and remediating those threats, and how difficult it can be sometimes to deal with lots of different platforms who all have different rules and who are all subject to different laws depending on where they are in the world. And finally, once we've done that, then we'll go to our key takeaways across both of these topics. So everything I'm going to talk about in this first part of the presentation, all the information is available in a white paper that we produced called A Taxonomy of Digital Threats. It's available through your GoToWebinar controls. So there's a handouts section. You'll see 2 white papers we put in there that you can download right now directly. And so I don't want you to feel like you have to take a lot of notes and write everything down that you see on these slides, or read every word that's on every slide, because the information I'm going to present in this portion of the webinar is all available in that white paper. And if you don't get a chance to download it or you lose it, you can always come to our website or send me an email, and I'll be happy to share those resources with you. So, the first question we might want to ask ourselves again is why do we even need to do this? Well, so if we look at what leading industry analyst firms like Gartner or Forrester say, or if we look at security conscious enterprises, over probably the past 5 to 7 years, they have recognized the seriousness of digital threats, and we've given a name to that category of product that we call digital risk protection, DRP. So, the reason I bring this up is if you want to learn more about services and products in these spaces, that digital risk protection phrase is what you're probably going to use to search the internet to educate yourself more or see what options are available to you. And so again, these organizations and these analyst firms view digital risk protection as a key element of information security and cyber risk management. And however, unfortunately, the definitions and the descriptions we have for digital risk protection and the digital risk landscape are often vague. And so what we're trying to do is make it more obvious and more concrete what we mean when we talk about digital risks. So if you don't know anything about digital risk as it's defined in this product category, just talking about digital risk doesn't really clue you into exactly what type of threats are we talking about. Are we talking about malware? Are we talking about network traffic issues? Are we talking about other sorts of issues? I think that'll be very clear to you here in the next few moments. So, just to be more specific here, what you often see is people will describe digital threats as threats that relate to a digital business process, or that reduce products that reduce risks that emerge from digital transformation, or that help secure your brand against digital security risks. None of those descriptions that I just said are wrong, but again, they're not very specific. So they don't really tell us anything useful. And so again, that's the motivation behind having this particular conversation. So and so when we think of the digital landscape, what are we talking about? So so in this image here, I'd like you to picture maybe your organization or your business inside of the circle, and imagine all of the more traditional items that exist in your technology stack or your security stack. So obviously we don't really talk about or think much about the perimeter anymore when we talk about security, because as all of you security professionals know, this concept of a perimeter, it doesn't really exist anymore. But if you think traditionally about kind of what's within the control of your environment, you might think of your firewalls and your network security appliances, and then further inside your business, you might think about device control and monitoring and remediation, anti-malware, antivirus, user and entity behavior analysis, all those sorts of things, and that's great. But there's this whole other realm of products and services that a lot of our organizations rely on that are offered as software as a service platforms, or that exist in the cloud. And because they exist out there, we don't typically have direct visibility or control over those things. If something bad happens on a device that belongs to my company, I have the ability, or my IT staff has the ability, to perform actions on that device, or isolate it from the network, or re-image the machine. But if my business uses Office 365 or Google Docs or something like that, it's less obvious. I can't run an agent in their cloud to quickly and easily identify things. And so because we rely more and more on SaaS products, and general internet services, which are represented by all the different categories you see around this circle here. Digital risk protection is all about helping organizations identify the risks and threats that exist in this space, and then giving you options to control and remediate those types of risks, which again, in comparison to the capabilities that we already have within the confines of our maybe on-premise systems, or the devices that we own, or the virtual appliances or physical appliances that we control. And so I hope that makes sense to everyone. But this is what we talk about when we talk about digital risk protection, is identifying threats in all of these different categories around the circle, and then having abilities to do something about them. So then moving directly on to that taxonomy, there are 4 primary digital threat categories at the top level of this taxonomy, and that includes theft and financial fraud that's targeting your customers and third parties, attacks on your organization's reputation, attacks against the enterprise and your employees, and emerging threats. And so while these 4 categories are presented as separate categories, there are going to be examples that you can find where a particular threat or risk, well, I should just say a particular threat might not fit neatly within only one category. So there's going to be some things that maybe overlap different categories depending on the type of attack that it represents or how it's constructed, and that's okay. This is not meant to be a perfect representation that works in all cases. It's just a means for you to organize your program and your thoughts around the different types of threats and risks that you might want to be prepared for, or have a playbook or some sort of programmatic way to address. And so just briefly, I'm not going to read through all of this, all the text here on this slide, because we're going to get to each of these things in part, but I just wanted to give you a bird's eye overview of the entire taxonomy. So this is what the entire taxonomy looks like. There's 4 primary categories at the top, and then some of those categories have subcategories, and I'm going to just cover briefly each of these. And now in the report, in the white paper that's available in the handout section, we present some additional information that helps you flesh out your understanding of these categories. So for instance, as you see here, we provide some example treatment around the threat actors and the motivations around our top level threats, as well as the reasoning about some of the indirect and direct impacts at a rudimentary level. So obviously the motivations, the actors and the impacts might differ based on your particular business or your security posture or your level of brand exposure. So you might want to consider, as an exercise, evaluating your organization and your program's maturity or readiness in the following direct categories, or you can choose any single item or pair of items beyond the category itself. So if you look at this 3rd row, for instance, you could work your way backwards from a strategy to address the indirect impact of damage to your brand and loss of competitive position by a threat actor, just as easily as you can move forward from the DRP threat category of attacks against the enterprise and employees to assess additional ways in which your security program, even beyond the DRP category, can help. So that might include adjacent areas like internal operational tools or other business systems. So I'm a big fan of doing what we call tabletop exercises, where you you get your team together and you invent an issue that they know, and you question, what would we do if this type of event or threat were to happen to us right now? Who would be responsible for what? How would we handle it? And what would our expectations be around our time to resolve this type of item? And by doing that, you're much more prepared when this thing might actually happen. Hopefully it never does, but being prepared is the best way to be successful in dealing with it. So anyway, moving on to category 1, theft and financial fraud that targets your customers or third parties, involves cyber criminals motivated by financial gain who in some way impersonate your company, your brand, or your employees. So the impacts on the enterprise here are mostly indirect. There's no money that comes out of your enterprise's budget when these attacks are successful, but there are indirect costs that are very real. So that could include the loss of current and future revenue because of damage to reputation and trust, And then depending on what your business is, whether you're a financial institution or maybe through some sort of insurance that you might have, sometimes there is a requirement or an ability for the people who do face that direct loss to have their lost funds restored, even if your business has no role directly in that fraud. So in addition to each of these primary categories, the taxonomy further delves into example tactics and detection techniques and remediation possibilities for each of the categories and subcategories. And as you can see, this category, we have 3 subcategories: financial fraud, counterfeiting and piracy, and identity theft and credential stealing. So as an example here, if we focus exclusively on the financial fraud subcategory of this category of threats, we can educate or remind ourselves of the basic components and the narrative of this threat type. So for instance, this row tells us that the threat actors often leverage fake accounts or takeover accounts, and that leads to various types of business loss and damage. But organizations do have the option to both detect and remediate against these threats, whether it be through something like monitoring domain registries or social media sites for lookalike accounts and domains that are meant to impersonate real domains or the legitimate domains of your business. And then you can run a process or leverage a partner when offending content is found in those places to have it removed or blacklisted. And again, this is exactly what we do at Zerofox. So just a quick example here. So we have a tweet with a coupon. So Under Armour, as I'm sure many of you are aware, is an international brand of athletic apparel. So athletic shirts and shoes and hats and things like that. And this is a coupon that is claiming that anyone who follows this link can receive access to a coupon for 50% off their next purchase. Now there's a lot of different things that could happen when you click on this link. In this particular case, let's imagine that that's exactly what's going to happen here, is that the attacker is maybe going to present a form to whoever clicks on this link to take some personal information that then they're going to maybe weaponize later in an attack, and then they will give that user something to print off their computer or some fake code, and then that person would then take that coupon to an Under Armour store and bring a bunch of items to the register and say, I'd like to use this coupon. And when this happens, a few different outcomes can take place. Obviously, whoever's checking that person out at the register can say this coupon's not real, and therefore I can't provide you with this discount. And that can lead to an angry customer or a lot of angry customers if there's a lot of these coupons floating around. But in addition to that, you have a lot of cases where the people who are receiving these fake coupons at these stores, they don't necessarily have the sophistication or the time to validate every coupon. They might know it's not real, but in order to prevent having an angry customer, they might give them some form of discount. Okay, this is not a real coupon. I'm sorry. I don't want you to be angry. I want you to be a loyal customer. I'll give you 10% off your purchase. Again, that's money that's coming directly out of your business that was not part of any real promotion. And so we have a piece of data here you can see on the slide from CyberSource that says retailers lost $3.5 billion last year to online fraud, and we see over 400,000 fake coupons a year. So again, this is just one example from this category. Here we have another example around counterfeits and piracy. This example is actually pretty complicated because there's a lot going on here. So we have a fake Twitter account that is pretending to be Nike. And in this post, we also have a domain, which you can see shopcheapnikeshoes.com above the picture in the tweet. That is an impersonating domain. So we have an impersonating Twitter account, an impersonating domain. And when you go to that impersonating domain, at least at the time when this was live, you had counterfeit shoes. So shoes that were pretending to be Nike shoes and that were not. So this is actually a multi-layered attack, which actually in our case can be helpful at times, because that gives us 3 different places to go after this particular adversary and either try to have their Twitter profile banned or removed, to go to the domain registrar to have this fake domain name or impersonating domain name removed. And additionally, we could go to that web host for that domain as well and report them for selling counterfeit goods. So again, these things all fit within that first category. And finally, briefly, here's an example here of social phishing and malware. I actually present this example later in more detail, so I'm going to skip it for now. We're going to see something that's pretty much the same thing a little bit later, but I'm going to move on to the second category now because we have a lot of material I want to cover, and so I promise we'll return to that in a moment. So the second category here, which is attacks on reputation, usually involves hacktivists or activists that are hackers that are motivated by either ideological or political factors, or maybe you have a disgruntled customer or employee who's eager to disparage your brand or your enterprise. And the impact here is usually indirect, again, such as lost revenue from damage to reputation or expenses that you incur in terms of countering that misinformation. So if people post false information about your business, obviously it can take a bit of time and effort to put together a PR campaign to highlight or identify that information is not real, and to track down all the sources where that information is being shared and have them removed or address those issues. So an example, I have two examples here from two famous CEOs. So Marcelo here in this first picture in the top left used to be the CEO of Sprint. And one day his account was taken over, and there was some strange kind of racist information posted on his Twitter page. And so obviously we all, I think we could all reason that the CEO of an international brand probably wouldn't post that, but it certainly leads to confusion. If I were an attacker, I probably would have handled that opportunity differently. If I could take control of his account and I were a black hat hacker, I would post something more believable, like, check out this unbelievable deal on the new iPhone for $300 off retail price. And then I would share a link, and then maybe, by clicking on that link, I would either harvest Sprint credentials or I would deliver malware in the browser, etc. And then likewise, another example of reputational damage. This other picture is of Jack Dorsey's Twitter account. Jack Dorsey, as many of you probably know, is the CEO of Twitter. Even he had his account taken over. I believe it was either very early this year or very late last year. I can't remember which. And there was information shared and spread there, which again, because people are following these personalities on Twitter, they're likely to accept the information that they post without thinking about the fact that it could be potentially dangerous, especially when there are links and especially when the information seems believable. And again, these things would then fall within this category. Moving on to the third category, we have attacks against the enterprise and employees. And so this might involve cyber criminals motivated by financial gain, as well as state actors and business competitors who are seeking intellectual property or embarrassing information to expose your company or cause you issues. So this typically causes direct costs, such as funds siphoned from bank accounts, or costs to notify customers of breaches and fines, perhaps for regulatory failures. And the indirect costs themselves can also be substantial. So that could include lost revenue from damage to your reputation and loss of competitive position stemming from maybe stolen intellectual property. So it's interesting to note that this category has more subcategories than any other. So it might be helpful to take a moment to read more about the distinction and differences between each of these when you review the full report. So we're just looking at the first two subcategories here. Here we can see there are some additional ones as well. So in the interest of time, I'm not going to cover those in more detail. Like I said, you can look at those in the report, or if you have any questions, please email me or submit a question. An example here would be business email compromise as an exemplar in this category. I'm going to cover in more detail an example here again in a few minutes. So I promise we'll come back to this example in some other material I have coming up. The last category in the taxonomy, the last primary category, is the emerging threats category. And this represents attacks that are in maybe the discussion or planning stages. So this includes potential fraud schemes or cyber attacks or attacks on your reputation that aren't in motion yet, but it might involve also threats of protests or physical attacks against your enterprise's locations or employees or executives. And the main difference between emerging threats and the other categories that we talked about is that, again, these threats have not yet been put into action or are in the very early planning stages. So these are campaigns that haven't gone active yet. So that means they normally can't be detected through direct evidence of an ongoing or successful attack, like a spear phishing attack or a spoof domain or stolen data posted to the dark web. Instead, if you're a defender, you have to find statements of intention and evidence of preparation. And that might include disclosure of vulnerabilities around software or appliances that you use, or what we call attack chatter on dark websites, again, where people are plotting, or by identifying exploit kits for sale that could be weaponized and used against your organization. This category has two subcategories, which include those statements of intent and attack planning, as well as that discussion of vulnerabilities and the sharing of attack tools or information about attack tools. So example here would be data leak or breaches, or again, people talking and discussing new vulnerabilities or new exploits for vulnerabilities that exist in the wild. So then, taking looking at all of these things in sum, we can see that there's a lot of different hallmarks of digital risk. And so these 6 types of digital risk that I've listed here are just a few. There's many, but when we look at these in total, we realize that if we don't have a security program that addresses these issues, we're potentially exposing ourselves to incurring a high cost to respond to these attacks when we face them. And so what I've done here is I've presented some report statistics that we just released last month from some of our own research. So we've seen a 48% year-over-year growth in financial services digital threat activity in the last year. Financial services is an interesting category because they represent so much money. They tend to be at the state of the art in terms of witnessing and dealing with this type of activity. And so they're usually an early or leading indicator in terms of what we're going to see in other categories or verticals of business. And so that's why it's important to pay attention to what's happening there. And in addition, we have seen a 4 times increase in financial frauds and scams since we reported in 2019. So this is, in the last year, we've seen this increase 4 times over. And so if you want more information about these types of threats and how they impact the financial services industry, we have a report that is available in the handout section of this this webinar as well. So I would encourage you to look at that. It's also available on our website for you to download at your convenience as well. So and this is what that report looks like. This is the cover of that report. So so now I'm going to share some examples again that I'm going to focus on that financial services industry in these examples, but again, you can consider these generally across probably any type of corporation or enterprise business. And so here we have an example where I've created a fake bank called Acme Bank. This is what Acme Bank's website looks like, but this is not actually Acme Bank's real website. This is, if you look real closely, you can see the URL is acmebank.us. And this was bought by an attacker. The real website is at acmebank.com. And so obviously an attacker can use this by sharing this URL with customers of Acme Bank. And when they go to this website, they think that it's their bank login, they log in, and the adversary then collects all those credentials and now has access to those bank accounts. Now, obviously, this is an attack that is common, and I'm not showing you or telling you anything you don't know. What I want you to think about, though, is if you're this bank, how are you proactively identifying when these domains are registered or when the site goes live, and how are you able to quickly identify those sorts of issues so that your customers don't lose financial funds? And then additionally, what is your game plan once you've identified these things? What's your game plan for removing them or having them removed off the internet by dealing with the website host or the domain registrar, etc. So something else you can do when you buy one of these impersonating domains is not only put up a website, but you can create an MX record. You can have a mail server, and then you perform business email compromise attacks as well. So in this case, in this example, what I'm really just trying to show here is that we have this person, Pat, sending an email to Jim. Now, Pat, in this case, is the VP of cyber risk for Acme Bank. But as you notice, this email is coming from acmebank.us, and it's going to the chief financial officer at acmebank.com. So what's happened is the attacker bought acmebank.us, they set up a mail server, and then they're pretending to be the VP of cyber risk, sending an email to the CFO saying, hey, can you change my direct deposit information so that my paycheck goes into this other bank account which belongs to the adversary? And again, these types of things happen all the time, but you can do something about it. Again, if you're proactively looking for these lookalike domains and you're proactively pursuing the mitigation and remediation of these items, then you can reduce the impact of this business email compromise on your employees. This is not a sophisticated attack. It doesn't require knowledge into how computer software runs or finding vulnerabilities. All you're really doing here is taking advantage of the trust that people have in seeing an email that looks like it comes from someone you know, from some colleague that you have. Likewise, you don't even have to register a fake domain. You can make a fake account on LinkedIn representing an organization, and then you can buy on the dark web fake accounts, puppet accounts, to then follow your fake LinkedIn profile so it looks like you're real and legitimate. So that would be an example of what we have here. Elon Musk, as many of you probably know, is the CEO of SpaceX and Tesla, and here is just an example. This was motivated by a real example. I just changed it slightly, but this is another one of those digital risks where, again, this is an example like we saw earlier with Jack Dorsey, where someone has taken control of his account, maybe because he didn't have two-factor authentication turned on, or there was some more sophisticated mechanism in which someone was able to take control of that account. Once they have control of that account, they give a URL, and then again, because people have this trust in all the things that this person normally posts, they very quickly believe this false information that's coming here as well. And so here, you're not monitoring for some new impersonating thing to show up. Here, you're actually monitoring to see if there's anything strange or suspicious or anomalous about an account that is normally whitelisted from your perspective, because it actually is a representative or an executive in your organizations. And so again, you do need to look out there for those impersonating accounts and those fake sort of issues, but you also need to be able to quickly identify when there's suspicious activity on this type of account, the same way that you would want to identify suspicious activity on one of your employees' computers, right? So if someone started exfiltrating a lot of information or started downloading a lot of files from file servers or things like that, it's analogous. It's the same sort of idea, and unfortunately, a lot of organizations aren't mature enough or don't have this consideration in their program, and so that's why I bring it up. And then this is an example of a dark web post involving Acme Bank, where an adversary is selling a bunch of information about, in fact, they're selling actual accounts and credit card numbers that belong to that bank. So again, if you don't have a mechanism to be identifying this type of information on the dark web as these things take place, then what you're doing effectively is you're not reducing the impact of this risk, right? So if we know this is coming ahead of time, we might be able to investigate and see which accounts were actually compromised, or by reviewing our logs or auditing our systems. And in that case, then perhaps we can either suspend those accounts and generate new credit card information or new account login information for our customers and get ahead of this problem. And there's many organizations who are able to do that, but if you don't try, you certainly won't be able to do that. And so that's why monitoring for these sorts of signals outside your enterprise is so important. And then here's another example. I promised I would come back to an example of social phishing or malware. So this is an interesting example. We see things like this quite often. Let me explain to you what's happening here. So we have a user, Kim, who is trying to use her PayPal account, and she's having an issue with it. So she posts about it on social media. A lot of people do that today. Rather than call a customer service line on the phone, they vent on social media, and then normally a large organization will have a social media team that looks for people talking about good or bad experiences with their company, and then they'll respond. But in this case, we had an attacker who registered a lookalike PayPal account on Twitter, waited for someone to mention that they were having an issue, and they were the first one to respond. And they responded by saying, "I'm sorry you had a bad experience with us. Click this link to help. We'll help get you linked in right away. We'll help get you logged in right away." You click this link, though, it goes to a site that's run and controlled by the attacker. And again, they can take that user's credentials and then have access to their account. And so again, this account, this fake PayPal account was sitting there for who knows how long, for days or weeks or months. If you were a company like PayPal, you would want to proactively identify these accounts and have them removed so that these types of attacks were not successful against your customers. And so I leave it to you as an exercise on your own to maybe look at some of these examples later. If you'd like a copy of the slides, send me an email, let me know, and think about how you would categorize these different attacks and where they'd fit in that taxonomy that we presented earlier. So, so just a word briefly about jurisdiction. Actually, I'll come back to that in a moment. I want to talk about what do you do when you find these things? We already talked about, how do you categorize these types of threats if you found them. We didn't really talk a lot about how you can proactively find them. Obviously, if you work with a DRP provider like Zerofox, that's what we do. We proactively identify these things for you, categorize them, deal with them for you, and or bring them, escalate them to your attention so that you can review them and tell us what you'd like to do. But if you have to do this on your own, or you're building a program to do this on your own, or you've never done this at all because it's not part of your job, I want to talk to you just briefly about how these things normally happen. So normally when you find something bad on the internet and it involves someone either impersonating your company or running some sort of scam or fraudulent activity that targets your company, what you might think is, okay, well, I'll just email the platform that's hosting that content, whether it be a social media website or whether it be a domain registrar, and you send them an email and you say, hey, there's this bad thing on your platform, I'd like you to take it down. Here, I've attached some evidence and some proof of who I am, and some evidence and proof that this individual or this content is not authentic and doesn't come from our company. So that's, a lot of times that's how you interact with these platforms. You have to send an email to some alias, and then you have to look at your watch and just wait for them to write you back. Some other sites deal with this issue so often that instead of sending them an email, they actually have a page where you answer like a questionnaire about what type of issue that you're dealing with, and then you submit that form, and then they respond to either through their platform's messaging service or again by email. And so what's interesting though is every platform will respond differently. Because we do this a lot at Zerofox, I've collected a lot of these responses and I've categorized them. And so I thought it'd be fun to just briefly look at the different types of responses you might receive initially when you submit a complaint dealing with these types of issues. So the first category, as you see here, is someone writes you back. You said, I found this problem on your platform. It either breaks the law or it breaks your terms of service, and it affects my company, so I'd like you to remove it. And someone writes you back from that platform, from that company, and says, we reviewed your request. We don't see a violation of our rules. This happens a lot. Even when even if you grab their hand or grab their head and show them exactly where in their rule book, in their terms of service, in their acceptable use policy, where this content is breaking the rules, a lot of times they'll just come back and say, we don't see an issue here, so there's nothing to see here. And that can be really frustrating. Another type of response you'll see is that you didn't invoke the right clause, or you didn't tell them the reason for removal that they wanted to hear. So here in this example, the part I've highlighted says, the platform wrote back and said, given the information you provided, it sounds like you need help with something else. You've asked us to take this down for this reason. That's not the reason we would take this down. And so this is almost like a game now where they're just delaying because there's no financial incentive for these companies to handle these takedown requests quickly and efficiently. That's not how they make their money. Unfortunately, they're usually just obligated legally to have some mechanism to request things to be taken down. And there are no legal requirements typically on how fast they have to do that. And so typically you have to kind of continue to ask over and over and over again. Here's another funny example that I've seen more than once, where we requested a piece of fraudulent content to come down from an impersonating an account, and the platform wrote back to us and said, we're not going to do anything, but maybe you should reach out to the person that has that account and ask them to remove it themselves. Maybe, did you ask them to take down the fraudulent content? That seems really silly, right? An attacker, an adversary that goes to all the trouble to create the scam isn't just going to decide to pack their bags and go home when you say, hey, you're targeting our company and our customers, can you please take that down? So I call this one, did you ask nicely? And it's a ridiculous idea that would ever work. And it's silly for a platform to suggest that. And this one can be difficult if you're in information security. You're probably not also a legal expert or a lawyer. So in this case, you've asked to take something down. Maybe it's a counterfeit website or a site that's pirating something that you own or your intellectual property, and they come back to you and say they want a court order. Well, that's okay, I guess, but that takes a long time. And what happens when you have a risk that exists and that's live for a long time? That means the impact of that risk is affecting your company in a much larger way. So, we find these things quickly, we want to remove them quickly. And these types of responses aren't helpful in doing that. And it can get even stranger. So in this one, they just said they need a court order. This one is even stranger because we were dealing with a domain registrar that was based in Estonia. And so they said we needed an Estonian court order. Now, I'm in America. I don't know anything about Estonian law or how to get an Estonian court order. And likewise, if you're in the Gulf region, you probably don't either. And so again, these companies put up all these barriers while at the same time, they purport to provide trust and safety, and some do a great job, and some try very hard, but others don't do as well. And you might have experience with this yourself. And then finally, this one is maybe the most burdensome response I've seen, which is in response to asking for an impersonation account to come down. So in this case, imagine someone's impersonating your CEO or an executive of your company on LinkedIn or some other platform. Maybe one of your SOC analysts sends in this request to have that account taken down. They write you back and say, I need you to send me a picture of the person at your organization that's being impersonated holding their government issued ID, and I need you to send me that picture. And now, because we're all security professionals, that should send off a lot of signals in our head that something doesn't feel good about this. So first of all, if I'm a level 1 or level 2 SOC analyst, I'm not going to email my CEO and say, take a picture of yourself with your ID and email it to me. We all know, email systems aren't necessarily the best place to keep secure, confidential information. But then on top of that, you're asking me to then send that information that belongs to my executive off through an email system to another organization where I have no insight into what their security policies or practices or the strength of their protection mechanisms are. And so unfortunately, though, this is how some platforms require you to prove that someone is impersonating you. And so again, I only bring these up just to highlight how difficult it can be to deal with some of these issues. And so when it comes to jurisdiction, again, I'm in the United States. And so I'm very familiar with US laws. And so when I see something on the internet that is fraud related or scam related, I tend to think in terms of my own experience with what my understanding of general US laws or state laws are. And you might do the same if you're in the Gulf region or if you're in Iran. You might be familiar with how the laws work and how policies typically are enacted in your region. But unfortunately, the internet is a global community. Well, I wouldn't say unfortunately. The fact of the matter is the internet is a global community. And so a lot of times the laws that we're familiar with or the expectations we have of the law in our own country or our own region don't necessarily apply to the systems where these things are hosted. And so that becomes a real issue. And so when we talk about jurisdiction, there's a lot of things we need to be aware of. There's the laws that govern where these systems and services are hosted. There's the laws that maybe your own region or country has in terms of the delivery of those services. And then there's the individual terms of service or end user license agreements or acceptable use policies that these platforms have and adhere to. And those are all fair game for you to identify and to justify the removal of this type of bad content. So I want you to think about those things. Another thing that you have at your disposal perhaps is money. So money crosses all jurisdictions. And so what I mean here, for instance, is if there's a platform and you advertise with that platform for your company's services, et cetera, one way you can often escalate the removal of fraudulent content is by leveraging that relationship, right? So if you're getting those types of responses we just looked at, where someone is trying to kind of delay or refuse the removal of a piece of content, you can remind them or go through that different arm of the organization that you pay a lot of money to have advertisements or run marketing campaigns. You can remind them that you give them a lot of money and that you would like to see this handled efficiently and quickly. Otherwise, you might decide that you don't want to spend as much money with them. Again, money is a universal language. And so, that's just, I'm not saying you always pull out that card, but it's something to keep in mind. And in terms of response strategy, I've broken down a lot of different ways to think about dealing with these types of issues in your own internal program. Again, if you have a partner like Zerofox, we actually handle all this for you. So you can outsource the identification, the classification, and the removal of all these things through our product and our services. That is what products and services in the DRP space do. I'm just looking at the clock, so I'm going to speed through a little bit of this. If you want this information, again, I'm happy to share my slides. But again, you can look at these issues a few different ways. So if we think about how we want to target this type of content, we can try to address it directly by having that content removed directly from the hosting platforms. But you can also try to indirectly target these things. So if you ask a domain registrar or a web host to remove something that is targeting your brand, and they are unresponsive or refuse, you can also do other things. You can submit the URLs to various phishing services. So for instance, I could submit a URL to the Google Safe Browsing team, or I could submit things to Fish Tank or abuse.ch. There's a lot of different organizations that collect this information and then distribute those lists to security products that will then block people from going to that site or give them warnings. And so an example of this would be, for instance, when you go to your browser sometimes to a site that's thought to have malware, Google Chrome, for instance, will say, are you sure you really want to go to this page? Because we think this page has bad stuff on it. This is enough to usually stop people. And this is a way to indirectly affect that adversary's ability to successfully perform their attack. And then in terms of intent, in the same way that we just talked about direct versus indirect approaches, you can think about, do I want to mitigate this particular issue, which might mean not necessarily having it removed, but just blocking or flagging the content so that it's not available either to my employees at the firewall level or the web application firewall level, or again, do I want to mitigate it by having it put on a blacklist versus remediation, which is to have that item removed wholesale. And so I only bring this up because these are different options and you can pursue them in parallel. And then finally, you need to think about who is going to actually perform this action on your behalf. Is it going to be a partner? Is it going to be a SOC analyst at your organization or your partner? Or is it going to be someone on your legal team? And the truth is, depending on the situation, that answer might change, but you need to think about these things ahead of time so that when one of these issues does occur, you're not all pointing your finger at someone else saying, this is not my problem, this is legal's problem, or legal is saying, hey, this isn't my issue, this sounds like a technical computer security issue, I think the SOC should deal with this, etc. And then likewise, you need to understand that these different actors move at different speeds. A SOC analyst is going to be able to write scripts to automatically do things, whereas maybe a legal person is that's a much more of a manual pen and paper sort of type of activity. And so you have to reason about your expectations in terms of what the cost is going to be for these different types of actors to deal with these issues, depending on what the issue is and how much time it's going to take. I have a process workflow here that's an example of a direct remediation. I just think for time, I'm not going to cover it, but this is what all I'm trying to represent here is, it's important to understand what your process would be when you find something that you want to take down. And so here's an example of how you might approach direct remediation. Again, if you want this content, let me know and I'll share it with you. And then in terms of expectations, they vary wildly, sorry. And so depending on the platform, you could get a really fast turnaround time, or you could get a very slow turnaround time. So what I did here is I looked at some of our own statistics over a period of time last year, and I looked at, for different platforms, whether it be Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, GoDaddy, whatever, a domain registrar, whatever. I compared, their different takedown times, and we saw things taken down in some cases on an average of 1.3 days since submission. For other platforms, it took up to 7.5 days. Now, this is all just social media platforms. When you look at broader platforms like domain registrars, sometimes it can take up to a month to have something removed. And often you have to ask multiple times as well. And that's just to rise above the noise of everyone else who's asking them to take things down. So quickly for takeaways, again, I'm just going to jump through here real quickly so we can see if we have any questions. But again, the more preparation, the more you prepare for these sorts of issues, the better you'll be able to perform when they occur. And so I encourage organizations to develop runbooks and to perform tabletop exercises to evaluate where there might be gaps in your process. I encourage SOC organizations to establish a relationship with their legal department and make sure that they understand who's responsible for what. And then again, also, it's you'll very rarely be successful if you request a takedown of something and you only ask once. It just, unfortunately, you have to be very persistent, and you have to remind these organizations that they're hosting content that breaks the law or breaks their terms of service, and you want it removed, and it's affecting your company or your customers or your employees. And then finally, the last thing I would suggest is make sure you set expectations with your peers or your superiors in your organization, so that they understand when something bad happens on the internet outside your control, that they don't have an unrealistic expectation of how quickly you can have it removed, right? Because that's just going to hurt your ability to do your job. And you might be judged unfairly based upon these other platforms' issues with responding quickly. I provided a bunch of links here on where you can learn more about takedowns and these sorts of risks. Again, I'm going to move quickly past this, so if you want these URLs, please let me know. When we think about how to deal with these issues at an organization, I tend to think about them in terms of 3 different personas. So rather than try to make one individual or one organization at the business responsible for all these issues, we think it tends to be more manageable to break them up. So you might look at some of these issues from the perspective of brand reputation and executive protection and whomever's responsible for that in your organization. And you might look at some of these other issues from the perspective of someone who's responsible for information security and data loss prevention. And then finally, there might be a corporate security function in your business that's more concerned with situational awareness or digital and physical risks. And so, obviously our platform helps address all of these needs and issues, and you might want to evaluate where you are more prepared in some of these categories versus others. So again, I provide 6 just kind of bite-sized ideas here on how you can start to address these issues in your organization or by working with a vendor. Again, just by looking at the clock, I want to go quickly by these, so I'm happy to share these slides. The content is available in the handout section that backs up a lot of the material I presented here. And with that, I want to thank you for spending your evening with us. I really appreciate it. I'm going to see if we have any questions here. Sorry, a moment. And we don't have any questions. If you have any questions, please feel free to email us. If you'd like to know more about Zerofox and how we help organizations identify and address these issues, again, you can visit us at zerofox.com. You can send an email to info@zerofox.com as well. I'm not a salesperson. I'm the Chief Security Officer. So if you want to have a conversation with me about how your organization faces these things, and you don't want any pressure to buy anything, you can reach out to me as a peer. My email address is here, and I'm happy to help you there. Or if I can help make an introduction to someone else in my organization that can help you evaluate our solution, I'm happy to do that as well. So again, thank you very much for having me. It was a big honor to be able to present to you. Thank you for your attention, and I hope this was useful or that you learned something new. And with that, I will conclude my part. I didn't know, Ali, if you had anything else you wanted to add before we ended the session.
Thank you.
But sure, thank
Yes.
you.
Thank you. Well, every start has an end, but I'm sure that this webinar was very exceptional and informative. Again, thank you, Sam, for sharing knowledge. Thank you, Amanda, and for your efforts. And thank you for everyone who attended this webinar. We hope that we get the record of this webinar very soon. And please take care and be safe. And bye-bye.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye. Thank you.